Ashley woke up from a long sleep. She assumed it must be morning, due to the sound of Linda getting ready for work. She got up and banged on the door. "Linda, will you let me out, please? I'm sorry. I promise I won't go anywhere." But Linda didn't answer her. She heard footsteps coming toward the room. "Oh, I know you're not going anywhere. I'll see to that," Linda said in a cold tone. "Linda, I'm hungry," Ashley cried. "You can eat your own shit for all I care," Linda shot back. Ashley could hear Linda walking away. The house was quiet. Then Ashley heard footsteps coming back to the room, then stop. "Back away from the door," Linda commanded. Ashley did as she was told. "Okay, I'm back," Ashley said, backing up to the middle of the room. Linda unlocked and opened the door. She quickly tossed in 3 pieces of bread and a bottle of water. She closed and locked the door again. Ashley went to check the door, hoping to open it, but to no avail. She looked at the bread and the water on the floor, picked them up, sat in the middle of the room, and ate. How long would Linda keep her locked in here, she thought? And what could she do to get herself out of this room? Time seemed to go by so slowly. Ashley would look at her watch, counting down the minutes. She dropped her cell phone by the door when Linda had attacked her. She took little naps here and there and sang songs to herself to try and pass the time. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she heard the front door open and close. Linda was home from work. "Linda!" Ashley called out, but she got no response. "Can I come out now, please?" She could hear Linda moving around the house. Linda changed out of her work clothes and sat down and watched TV as if everything were normal. Ashley could even hear her laughing at the show she was watching. Then, all of a sudden, the doorbell rang. Linda stared at the door for a moment, wondering who it could be. Ashley jumped up and ran to the door. She put her ear to the door and tried to hear who it was. Ashley heard footsteps quickly coming down the hall. "You make one sound, and I'll make you sorry. Do you understand me?" Linda's tone was sharp, and Ashley could tell she meant it. "Yes, ma'am," Ashley replied, but she kept her ear to the door. She could hear Linda walking to the front door. The bell rang again. Linda unlocked and opened the door. She was surprised to see who was standing there. It was Jacob. She stared at him, not saying anything. Jacob finally broke the awkward silence. Hi, I'm Jacob. I go to school with Ashley." Linda just stared at him. Jacob could feel the tension, so he figured he'd better make this quick. "She dropped her bracelet at school the other day. I brought it for her. Here." Ashley was still with her ear to the door, heard all of this. The sound was a bit muffled, but the door was thin enough to where she could hear and make out the words. She looked down at her wrists and grabbed where the bracelet would have been. She hadn't even noticed it was gone. "I'll take that," Linda said, extending her hand to take the bracelet. Jacob handed it over. "Is she okay? She wasn't at school today," he asked. "She's fine," Linda said sharply. "Let me tell you something. Don't come back to this house ever again. And I don't want you talking to Ashley anymore. Do I make myself clear?" Linda went to close the door in his face. "Oh, something's wrong with you," Jacob said underneath his breath before the door was fully closed. "Excuse me, what did you say?" Linda sounded angry. "I said there's something wrong with you, and I know you've been hurting her." "You get the hell off my property," Linda said. Jacob went to grab his bike. He was trying to keep silent, but couldn't. "I can't wait till she goes away with me and can be happy when she's away from you." Linda stared furiously at him and went back into the house. Jacob hopped on his bike, turned around, and started to pedal off. The The sound rang out and echoed through the yard. A large group of birds scattered from a tree from the sound. Jacob stopped and looked down. He saw a red spot spreading on his t-shirt. He took 2 shallow breaths and fell over. Linda stood watching from the door with a revolver in her hand. She looked around and saw that all was quiet again. She went back into the house and put the gun back in the cabinet where she'd gotten it from. Without hesitation, she went out to the shed in the backyard and grabbed a plastic tarp. Quickly running to Jacob's body, she rolled the boy over to check his pulse to make sure he was dead. Clasping onto his wrists, she could hear the faint beating. He still had a pulse. Jacob was alive. His lips trembled. The fear in his eyes made him look like a scared child. Linda grabbed the edge of the tarp and placed it over his face and pressed down with both hands. He grabbed and kicked his legs, but he was too weak to fight her off. He stopped fighting, and his body stopped shaking. She had smothered the rest of the life out of him. She flattened out the tarp, rolled his body into it, and dragged him to the backyard, stopping momentarily only to catch her breath and think about what to do next. She went back to the shed and grabbed a shovel. It had rained the previous night, so the ground was soft enough to dig a hole, she thought. She dragged his body over to the area where all the animals had been buried, grateful that the boy's body didn't weigh too much. Linda dug a shallow grave and pushed Jacob's body in. She started to cover his body with the fresh dirt. Then she paused. She contemplated for a moment, dropped the shovel, then went back inside the house. She quickly came back out with something in her hand. She returned to the grave and threw the dead kitten on top of Jacob's body. "A little company for you," she snidely said, and finished covering him with dirt. When she had finished, she went to the front of the house, got his bike, and put it in the shed. There was a look of pride on her face, a look of accomplishment, a look of victory. Linda went back into the house, grabbed 3 pieces of bread and a bottle of water. From the kitchen, Ashley could hear her coming down the hall. "Stand back from the door, Ashley," she said. She opened the door and threw in the bread and water. "I have to use the bathroom," Ashley said. Linda looked around the room and saw a wet spot on the carpet where Ashley had relieved herself. "Okay, let's go," Linda said. She stepped back from the door to let Ashley out. Ashley cautiously walked past her and went to the bathroom down the hall. Linda followed right behind her. Once in the bathroom, Ashley looked around for something she could use to help her, anything at all. There was a small screwdriver on the cabinet. She grabbed it and stuffed it into her pocket. She quickly used the restroom and came out. On her way back to the room, she looked at Linda's hands and saw they were dirty. "What did you do to Jacob?" she asked, but Linda didn't say a word. Ashley stopped and turned around. She was angry now. "What did you do to Jacob?" Her eyes began to water up. Linda tilted her head slightly. "You won't be going anywhere with him. Ever." The emphasis on ever sent a chill down her spine. She grabbed Ashley by the arm and escorted her back to the room. "How long are you going to keep me in here?" Ashley asked. Linda guided her back in. "Until I figure you're ready to come out." She closed the door and locked it. Ashley put her hands in her pocket and pulled out the screwdriver. She looked at the doorknob and saw 2 small screws on each side of it. She had made up her mind. Tonight would be the last night she spent in that room. Ashley sat in the middle of the room thinking about Jacob, wondering what had happened to him. Was he okay? She never knew Linda had a gun. She didn't even know what a gun sounded like in real life, but she knew that loud shot had to have been a gun. One thing for sure, she knew she had to get out of there. Linda had gone insane. That night, Ashley waited for the lights to go out. That way she knew Linda had gone to bed. She could hear it raining outside, and she also heard the weatherman say that a storm was coming tonight while Linda was watching the news. She hoped the sound of the thunder and rain would cover any noise she made. She waited and waited, and finally, the storm came. And indeed, it was loud. The thunder was continuous and provided just the cover she needed. Ashley pulled the screwdriver out of her pocket, lined up the tip of the screwdriver with the screws, and gently began to turn. She turned them out until the screws were ready to fall out, and pulled them out the rest of the way with her fingers. She had to perfectly time knocking the doorknob out with the thunder, waiting patiently for the thunder to sound. Then finally, it came. The low rumble at first, then the loud booming. She pushed the other side out, and it fell to the floor. She was grateful that the floor had carpet on it, so it muffled the sound. Ashley slowly opened the door. A flash of lightning illuminated the dark house. She started to go out the front door, but where would she go in the storm, she thought. She decided to sneak out to the backyard and hide in the shed until the rain let out, and leave before Linda woke up. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get out of there. Unlocking the back door, she slowly opened it, taking one more look back into the house. Everything was quiet and dark. She stepped outside, gently closing the door behind her, and ran out into the rain. While crossing the yard, headed toward the shed, she noticed a fresh mound of dirt. It was a lot bigger than the ones that had been dug for the pets. Ashley ran into the shed and quickly looked back at the house. There was no sign of Linda. Her plan had seemed to be working, so she took a sigh of relief. She backed up into the shed, and her eyes locked into something that made her pause. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. It felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. It was Jacob's bike. She could see him in her head on the bike, smiling at school. What was it doing here, she thought. She placed her hands on the handlebar. Then she saw the shovel behind the bike, with fresh clumps of dirt still on it. Looking out into the yard covered with water, she thought about the fresh mound of dirt she saw on the way to the shed. "Oh God, no," she said to herself. Ashley grabbed the shovel and headed back into the yard. The rain poured. Her wet hair laid over her head like a heavy hood. She stood over the grave with the shovel in hand, not knowing exactly what to expect or what to do. She breathed heavily, terrified and angry at the same time. But she needed to see what was buried under there. She lifted the shovel and began to dig and move away the soft, muddy dirt. She didn't have to dig deep before she felt something solid. She scraped away a little bit more mud and saw what looked like plastic. She pushed away a little bit more. Overcome with emotion, she fell to her knees and frantically began to slide away the mud with her hands. She slid away more and more until she saw it. Through the plastic, she could see a face. She pushed away a little more, and with the help of the rain, it became clear what she was looking at. She burst into tears as she saw the face of the boy who had only wanted to help her and paid for it with his life. A bright flash of lightning lit up the yard, exposing a figure standing right behind her. I wish you hadn't have found that. Linda's shrill voice cut through the sound of the rain. Ashley quickly turned and stood up facing Linda. Why did you have to kill him? You're sick. Ashley quivered with anger. I hate you. Ashley looked down and saw a gun in Linda's hand. Are you gonna kill me now too? Ashley's frustration and hopelessness had boiled over, almost wishing Linda would just do it and get it over with. Linda just stared at her and moved her hair out of her face. She looked empty. The rain continued to pour, and they stood there soaked, and Ashley was exhausted. I never wanted any of this to happen, Linda said, shaking her head. Things just got out of hand. I just didn't want to be alone. And I can't change what I've done. I know that you don't want to stay with me. I know you don't want to be here. And neither do I. Linda raised the gun toward Ashley. I'm sorry. She aimed the gun at Ashley's face. Then, Linda, what in the hell are you doing? A man's voice yelled out. Linda turned to see who it was. It was John, the neighbor. Ashley, remembering she had the shovel in her hand, swung and hit Linda in the head. Linda raised her arm just in time to block the blow, but it was strong enough to knock her off balance, and the gun went off. Ashley dropped the shovel and ran for the house. Linda turned, got to her knees, and fired a single shot at Ashley. The bullet grazed Ashley's right leg. She screamed in pain, but managed to keep going and get into the house. Linda, stop! John pleaded. Linda turned and callously fired a shot to John's chest. He collapsed to the ground and didn't move. Linda turned and began walking to the house. Before she got far enough, she could hear John talking. It was faint, but he was still alive. She turned to see him on his phone. He had called the police and was telling them to come. Linda quickly walked over to him and raised the gun. John raised his hand in defense, but Linda fired 2 more shots, killing him this time. Linda stalked back to the house. She walked through the back door, looking for Ashley. Come on out, Ashley. Let's not play this game. You know I'm gonna find you. Don't be scared. I'm going with you. We'll go together. But Ashley didn't say a word. Linda waited a moment, becoming angry. Come out, goddammit! Ashley had hid in the kitchen pantry. She could hear Linda tearing through the house, looking for her, but she stayed quiet. She could feel the blood running down her leg. She didn't know what to do. Then, she heard it. A sound that she thought she'd never be so grateful to hear. The sound of sirens. The house had gone quiet. She didn't hear Linda's rummaging anymore. She slowly pushed the door open to the pantry, just enough to peek out. The house was eerily silent. Little by little, she opened the door and slipped out. She limped in pain through the kitchen, leaving a trail of blood behind her. Still not hearing anything, she could see the police lights flashing through the windows. Stepping into the living room, she looked around. There was no sign of Linda. Her heart beating faster and faster, the fear rising. She forced herself to run to the door. Ashley unlocked and opened the front door. Seeing the 2 police cars in the yard made her feel secure. She was about to step out of the house. Then, she fell to the floor and screamed. She looked over her shoulder and saw blood. It had begun to cover her shirt. She had been shot again. She turned around and saw Linda standing behind her. Ashley summoned all the strength she had to get up and make it into the yard to the police. She struggled, but her will to live was strong, and she was determined not to let this be the way that she died. She collapsed as soon as she made it to the officers. The police quickly emerged from their vehicles, guns drawn, looking toward the house. They couldn't see the source of danger, so they approached very cautiously. Back in the house, Linda stood in the living room, calm and unemotional. She looked at the gun for a moment, completely ignoring the police orders to come out. She raised the gun and put it in her mouth, took a deep breath, and pulled the trigger. The gun clicked, but it did not go off. It was empty. Outside, the police continued to order Linda to come out of the house with her hands up. By this time, an ambulance was pulling up for Ashley. The officers kept a close eye on the front door. Then, a dark figure emerged from within. Linda stood in the doorway and didn't move. "Come out with your hands up now!" the officer shouted. Linda slowly walked out into the yard, but still had the gun in her hand. "Drop your weapon!" the officer shouted. But Linda just kept walking toward them. Ashley had moved behind the officers and was now sitting on the ground, where one of them was tending to her wounds. She watched as Linda walked toward the police, with her arms down at her side, still holding the gun. "Drop the weapon, lady!" they shouted, but she just kept coming. Linda stopped and looked past the officers. She had spotted Ashley behind them and stared at her. The hopeless look on her face was haunting. She mouthed, "I'm sorry," and raised the gun at the officers, even though she knew it was empty. They immediately fired upon her, filling her with bullets. The officers only stopped once she hit the ground and lay motionlessly. Ashley screamed and turned her head. The officer tending to her did his best to comfort her. The paramedics were giving the okay signal to come and tend to Ashley. Two of the officers slowly walked over to Linda and kicked the gun away. One knelt down and checked her pulse. He looked at his partner, then began performing chest compressions. The medics had by now put Ashley on the stretcher and was wheeling her into the back of the ambulance. She raised her head to see Linda lying on the ground, the officer performing CPR. Ashley passed out from blood loss and exhaustion. The next time she opened her eyes, it was dark. Her blurred vision only made out the ceiling and the dark room surrounding her. She looked down and saw she was in a hospital bed. Her vision started to clear. She held up her arm and winced in pain from the shoulder injury to look at the hospital bracelet. She looked over at a dark corner in the room and saw Linda sitting in a chair. She was wearing a hospital gown and was staring expressionless at her. Ashley screamed. The sound prompted two nurses to rush into the room and turn the lights on. "What's the matter, honey? Are you in pain?" the older one of the two asked. Ashley pointed over to the corner where she had seen Linda, only to see an empty chair. "Go get Dr. Shaw," the older nurse said to the younger one. Then she went to check Ashley's vitals and IV. "You're okay, sweetie, you're okay. The doctor's on his way to speak to you now." She gently pushed Ashley's hair out of her face. The doctor and the younger nurse came back into the room. "Hi, Ashley. I'm Dr. Shaw. I'm happy to see you're awake. We've tended to your wounds, and you were very fortunate. Your calf only suffered a flesh wound, and the bullet passed right through your shoulder. You're already stitched up and doing well. You're going to be just fine. When you're feeling better..." "Doctor," Ashley interrupted. She looked over at the empty chair again. Linda, Dr. Shaw took a deep breath, looked back at the other two nurses, and looked back at Ashley. Ashley, Linda died back at the house. They weren't able to save her. I'm sorry. He continued speaking, but Ashley had totally tuned him out. She didn't hear a word he said after that. Her eyes had gone empty, and she felt numb all over. Had Linda really died? Or were they just telling her this because they didn't want to stress her out? She just seen her sitting there in that chair. Or had she? It all seemed so real. What would happen to Ashley now? Only God knows. Hello all, and thank you so much for supporting the channel. If you've liked this content, please click the like button, share, and subscribe to receive notifications for new dark stories. Until the next time, be good to each other. It's a scary world out there.